All right. Well, so welcome. So we were just chatting a little bit about, we're finishing the book, and 3 chapters might have been daunting, but from my own perspective, chapter 8 was just a little bit weird. So we're really going to probably spend most of our thinking time on whatever you want, but I'm imagining on chapters 6 and 7. And so I don't want to own this meeting. I want to start out by inviting just your response on chapters 6 and 7 with just the reminder. Chapter 7 talks about Black and white feminism and how that they interplay and how they're different. And chapter 6 is that real crux of her theology of the cross. And it was really powerful because I was transcribing my notes into a more permanent place yesterday for me. So I just want to open the floor to what caught your attention, what bothered you, what you'd like to do with this work personally or spiritually, or whatever else you'd like to talk about.
Mike, it was, I mean, my goodness, that was a lot. And it's not so much the number of pages that we read, it's what was on them, right?
Yeah.
And I just found it fascinating, absolutely fascinating and completely engaging. And I felt like I'm starting to understand what she's meaning by this wilderness experience, the importance of Hagar. I feel like I'm starting to understand it. And what a groundbreaking work in this book, that she's finally was putting it down in a book that Black women have been left out of every liberation movement.
Yeah.
It's astonishing, and especially the Black church. What I got, Mike, was the faith of Black women is about survival, not liberation. They don't have any liberation. So the quote, Black church has built itself on the Exodus, which is I mean, just it's terrific. But then they don't talk about the victimization of the victims by the old victims by their new victims.
Yeah.
At all. And the invisibility of the women that I didn't quite get a hold on where she was going there, but just they're very erased. Black women are very erased. And the Cone brothers that she talks about in Black liberation theology never mention women. They never mention Harriet Tubman. How'd that happen? Who was, I believe, wasn't she even called Moses? Did I get that straight?
I did. Your last line I didn't hear. Maybe my speakers are acting up.
Harriet Tubman, I believe, was even called Moses.
Yeah, she was called the Black Moses. Yeah.
So how could those guys leave her out of their Exodus theology? So even she was not given a place.
Well, actually, I think I can speak to that if you want me to. Biblically, when the Hebrew people cross the Sea of Reeds, Miriam sings a song. Miriam sings a song that says, "I will sing unto the Lord, for God has triumphed gloriously, the horse and rider thrown into the sea." And then Moses sings that same song and adds a couple of verses, and we give credit to Moses, not Miriam.
Thank you.
I'd never thought of that, Mike.
It's wild, isn't it, that
yeah.
you actually get the biblical citation that this was Miriam's song. So the Bible says she did it first, but then the long developed one is ascribed to Moses. And by the way, he doesn't reference her at all. He doesn't, there's no footnote.
Right.
Miriam said this first.
Right. And I think it's possible that the added verses were her verses to begin with.
You got
and
it.
they just put them in there because Moses was singing it.
And it's real interesting to hear that as like a hermeneutical frame for everything she talks about in the book. And like, I remember what she said in chapter 4 about why we don't say like black men, black women, we call them the blacks. And that's because women worked in the fields just like men, but also had to prop up men and raise children that weren't their own.
And she makes another point about grammar. The use of he includes, there's no male, no female pronoun in there. It's a male pronoun, even when referring with women included.
And that's her point, right, about masculinization of the Black female experience in the antebellum South, because Black women had to do the same physical labor as men. And she talked about this point that later women do all the farm work and men are mechanics.
The glory job.
I mean, again, it's really wild. And like you say, right, it's interesting that even in the Black community, and look, I don't want to sound overcritical of the Black community, but as I read her own words, right, she's citing these male authors who have really great thoughts, but they are really just speaking from the Black male perspective. And her argument is that those people can only say what they say because they've been propped up by Black women, and they ignore the very people who propped them up.
That's invisibility.
That's invisibility. That's right. Yeah.
And it goes on today. It's the same thing, kind of thing happening today.
Yeah.
So her theme about Christianity as, I'm going to say, as practiced, as truly being an extension of the slavocracy, really did hit home with me really hard, and has given me great pause for reflection. She lays it out very clearly, and then I'm looking at a paragraph that's, I think, is on page 134. I'm working from a Kindle, so I'm not exactly sure what page it's on. Starting out, pointing out these problems with the use of the Bible in Black liberation theology.
Yeah.
And I think what she's referring to there is the Hebrews are liberated, but the Bible nowhere condemns slavery of other people.
Yeah.
And the Bible has been used as, those sections that are pro-slavery have been used to justify slavery in the U.S.
Yeah.
Forever, right?
Forever, yes.
In order that liberation theology might also show theologians that in order to respond to the tensions in African American faith and suggest woman inclusive correctives, which sounds pretty good to me, they might have to rely on non-Christian and non-Jewish sources to interpret texts and shape their talk about the community's understanding of how God relates to its life. I think I could have used a whole chapter on that.
Mm-hmm. Well, we probably have to write that chapter, Lila.
Well, let's get busy, Mike.
Well, and I think you could, because that's the approach you take with us as we study.
Oh, I don't think I should write that chapter.
Well, I think you should.
No,
I think you could as a white, yes.
As a white man, I should write about the female experience.
I think it's time that we speak up and say, oh my goodness, is this what you guys are saying? How else do we start dialogue? I mean, that's a real question. How do we
Well, I
start?
think it is a great question, and I want you to consider how we've like formed a liturgical element in church where somebody gets up and gives a sermon, and that's a monologue. So you tell me how we're going to have dialogue in a church service.
Well, we might have to go outside that and write a book, Mike.
Well, I think adapting the liturgy is interesting. I find increasingly like I can ask people to raise their hand if they've done experience Q, and I see more people doing that. I remember when I first got here, they were just like crickets, because asking people to respond is like, and I do sometimes ask rhetorical questions and people answer them, and that's really great, and I hope they don't get mad at me when like the answer they're supposed to give is the wrong one, like, but it's, like it's really difficult, right? And so like, sometimes I think what I try to do is have a dialogue with myself in front of everybody to say like, here's a dialogue you can have, but ultimately like the worship service as we do it is like not dialogical.
At least not when it's working correctly.
Well, it's challenging, like, and again, once upon a time, somebody did stand up in the middle of a sermon and start talking. Now, there wasn't any dialogue. He was just crazy, and and we all were like, where's the closest exit? Like, because it wasn't even, I mean, who knows what that guy was talking about? And it was fine, but it also was like, it was really like destabilizing. Oh, this is tough. And what she highlights, I realized like, I don't think I've ever given a sermon on like how to handle your husband beating you. Or like, boy, I do not feel great talking about child rearing, other than to say it's really hard. I feel like I say that a lot, and how like, oh my God, like I've wasted lots of time as a parent doing this and that. Like I say that kind of stuff. But I don't know that I speak to the themes that she talks about in the book, like again, like women make 80% of church, and 90% of what's said in the pulpit is masculine values.
So this wilderness experience she talks about, Mike, is this her offering for how to bring Black women into the fold? And I'm not sure I have this straight yet, but what I found in the book was on page 141 or 142, she talks about because the Black women are left out of the Exodus, then she's looking at the Hagar experience in the wilderness, the wandering in the wilderness after the Exodus, the grumbling against having been liberated and now there's nothing to eat, and that it's the wilderness that makes this group into a cohesive culture and makes prophets, and also emphasizes survival. This making a way out of no way.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think what I appreciate she says, right, is that the womanist value is liberation. But in the meantime, we've got to work on survival with limited resources and enhancing quality of life. That actually seems like very logical to me. I don't know either if any of you were struck by her contrast of Mary and Hagar. And just as a reminder, she even says like Mary is a surrogate. Mm-hmm. And she uses this phrase that's really tough, like Mary is mounted by the Holy Spirit. That's a tough phrase, right? And she talks about how both women essentially are powerless. So there's like some union between white feminism and Black feminism, but how Mary can be a symbol of like white Victorian ladies, because Mary appears to be more pliant and delicate, and that's the tradition that we've got. And Hagar doesn't have those luxuries. I never really thought about Mary being a symbol of oppression for Black, not a symbol, but like the tension between these two ladies and the way they have experience. It was kind of gritty. And I hadn't really thought a lot about Mary's surrogacy either, but that frame is an interesting frame.
And she draws a comparison between enforced or
coerced.
Coerced, thank you. Coerced versus voluntary surrogacy, and how Mary's voluntary surrogacy is lifted up and honored and used as a model for women, Christian women today, that we should voluntarily be surrogates. We should voluntarily bow down and say, do with me what you want.
Yeah.
But in one of the sermons that you gave, you said Mary was the first person to say yes.
Yeah, I've heard that thought, and I actually kind of appreciate that thought. To me, that's a way of taking her wilderness frame and saying, like, Mary actually gets the wilderness in the yes, and she chooses to walk through it. So I think, there's many ways we can read these characters, right? And one is that Mary actually does know what that choice involves, and she might have the choice, right? And when you have the choice, it's like, to me, that's the wilderness experience that she's talking about, that is both positive but also difficult. When you don't have the choice, then that's the forced surrogacy role.
I'm kind of interested in comparing what she wrote to what Gutierrez wrote in his book.
Yeah.
It seems to me that there is not one Christianity, but there's a broad number of Christianities, and they can't all be put together.
Yeah, my thinking is that you're right, that there may not be one, and nor should there be one. I don't think there should be one. I think actually what's interesting is, like, a voice like this, and if you can put that with Gutierrez, they may not totally line up, but I think somewhere in that tension is where you find more fullness, right? And I think what's really difficult, with reading a book like this, is to say, like, oh, this is not what I'm used to, and I don't know that I can totally convert to this image, because I found a lot of value when I'm used to, and it's not an either or. It's a wow, this puts some tension in some of my roles. Like we'd said, Mary might be the first woman who said yes. I actually find that really, like, thoughtful. She doesn't come up with that idea. I don't have to dispense with that idea. I can hear, like, oh, that's some more stickiness around that. And that, I think that stickiness allows for a whole lot more, not just individuation, but dialogue. Because I think, like the Hindu idea is that the truth is so important, you can't express it simply.
Also, do you remember the quote that I sent you from the book Gods of the Upper Air?
Yeah.
About the gods we make?
Yeah, Zora Neale Hurston says, right, that our gods are a lot like the people who made them.
Yes, yeah.
We make gods in our own image.
That's, yeah, something similar to that. Yeah. So this is a really interesting thing for me in chapter 6, where she says, in the womanist experience, Jesus is the ultimate surrogate, and that the cross is the epitome of sin. I'm trying to get my head around that. The cross is the epitome of surrogacy, sin, rape, coercion, and how we parade that in and out, and that's on the back wall, and like how that functions in a worship setting. And it seems like there's this, like, sort of dual tension, right? Like, you don't want to worship the epitome of sin, but you do want to be reminded about that experience, and how, like, razor's edge that line is to have to try to walk. I don't think she argues we should do away with the symbology. I think she's trying to say, like, look, most people accept this thing worshipfully instead of saying, like, I mean, it's just, she kind of says, like, the cross is like Auschwitz-Birkenau. It's a monument to something that should not happen again, instead of a tourist attraction. She convinced me, by the way.
This has really changed how I look at the cross.
There's a lot of hymns in the hymnal that have made me ill for years. I'm just going to be honest. And, you know, I guess I'll go on the screen and say this. The DOK hymn is Lift High the Cross, and it's like my least favorite hymn, like in the world. It's like really gross.
Yeah, it's got a great tune though.
I mean, I hate that hymn. The only one I dislike more in the Episcopal hymnal is Onward Christian Soldiers. But they kind of go together, right?
And we grew up singing that in Sunday school as a little kid. That was one of the Jesus loves me, and Onward Christian Soldiers.
And it's really strange, even though I hate the lyrics, how it's still like emotionally evocative for me, because I was formed like, this is what life is all about. And it brings up that line, right, about victims becoming victimizers. Onward Christian Soldiers is about victims becoming victimizers. I told you that line on Trinity Sunday. It's called Lex Orandi, Lex Credendi. What gets practiced is what gets, like, we give our hearts to. There's a book called Praying Shapes Believing, but I think, like, even more so, what we sing is what we fall back on. And most of the hymn lyrics, when you really pay attention to them, are like really gross. I sometimes, when I'm running and my mind goes on like auto tune, you know, and it's just kind of like whatever, I'll start like counting my cadence by singing, what can wash away my sin? I have to change the word, nothing but the love of Jesus, because the other phrase is just like, it's like, it's scary, right? It's kind of scary. And I'm like a priest saying this stuff. And what I don't get, right, is like, why do we keep writing hymns like this? Like, why don't we write hymns that are like, remember the cross and don't do it again? You know, I had this really good Mennonite friend at the Episcopal camp I was on the board at out in San Diego. There's this song called Pharaoh, Pharaoh, you know, Pharaoh, Pharaoh, oh, baby, let my people go. Huh, la, 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 la. And there's this line, right, that all of Pharaoh's army did the dead man's float. And he changed it to, and all of Pharaoh's army learn from their mistakes. You know, it was like, that seems like really good to me. Learn from their mistakes. Like, that's what we'd really like to do, you know, like we'd like to learn from their mistakes instead of like being slain. And that's where I come back to like what she does, where she says, like, look, we don't necessarily, it's not our job to take scripture and say like, this is really great, and let's pattern our lives around it. Sometimes we need to say like, look, God is partial in these scriptures, and we have to decide whether we believe that or not. And if we don't believe it, then we're just going to critique this text and say like, look, this is somebody's perspective, but it can't possibly be right. So I think there's this really interesting hermeneutic she doesn't quite say, but that like is growing in me, where I can say, look, a lot of the Bible it frames people's experience. And you know what? I have a lot of feelings that are really strong, and it doesn't mean they're true. It's true I have those feelings, but they don't represent the truth. So like I have to, and this is a way that I get God off the hook, as I say, I don't think God is partial. But I think I experience God on my side. So I have to take that feeling and I have to say like, oh, this feels like something, and it's not the whole picture. And when I read the Bible and I hear that feeling, I have to say like, oh, I get that feeling. And I can't rest in that feeling. because there's a whole lot of other feelings out there. So really, what's the experience that's going to honor all of those feelings? I mean, the scripture this week is that a house divided against itself can't stand, right? And so if Beelzebul drives out demons, his house is divided. So if you get freed from slavery so you can enslave other people, that's a house divided, right? I mean, let me air out. I want to know what your response, how this struck you. And I'm okay if you say, I hate it. The cross is the epitome of sin, rape, and coercion. How did that phrase strike you?
Where is that, Mike? I missed
In
that.
chapter 6. You probably want a page number. I don't underline when I read, so that's a hard thing.
I noticed that about your book on Vision Quest.
Yeah, you're not supposed to do
Wow.
that. Here's what I do when
How
I
does
read.
he do that?
Here's all my notes from the whole book. And I don't write them in the pages because if I do that, I have to go back and read the book again. And I want to read the book one time.
Okay. The
I'll talk
cross
to you
is,
about that later because I used to teach speed reading and comprehension classes.
oh, could you just repeat that? Then the cross is the epitome.
Yeah, she says in chapter 6, the cross is the epitome of sin. The cross is synonymous with rape, with surrogacy, and mocking the ministerial vision of Jesus. So her theology of the cross, or of the incarnation, right, is all about Jesus's ministerial vision, not his death. She ultimately says something like, the things to value about Jesus are that he conquers sin in the wilderness, that he drives out evil spirits, that he heals people to think about his words and expelling evil, that he prays and shows compassion. So she finds no glory whatsoever in the cross. And a criticism she has is that Black and white men share a male bond in valuing the cross instead of in essentially rejecting it or learning from it. Right, and her vision of resurrection is that it is about the indefatigability of the ministerial vision of Jesus. I think I got that right. I mean, I think those are good summary statements. I'm not giving you line by line, Lila, but it's towards the end of chapter 6.
Yes, thank you, Mike. No, I thank you. Yeah, I picked up page 147.
And I like on page 148, I think a summary of that last paragraph in that section. Humankind is then redeemed through Jesus's ministerial vision of life, not through his death. There is nothing divine in the blood of the cross. Yeah.
She goes on to say, right, as Christians, Black women cannot forget the cross, but neither can they glorify it. And that seems like an invitation, not just to Black women, but to all Christians. We can't forget the cross, but if we glorify it, what we're really doing is glorifying a domination system that killed a marginal Jew.
I'm a little curious as to how the vision that she has fits into the Bible in totality, because the Bible seems to, from what she says, seems to always speak about the odd where we're not helping people to get out of slavery, but keeping them in it. So it's a little confusing to me.
I think that's a really fair confusion, Tim. And the only thoughts that I can really think through, I think it's kind of hard to like just be carte blanche affirmative, right? Because we're going to read a story on Sunday about how Israel decides they want a king. And they're told, like, look, the king is going to tax you, and they're going to take your sons and send you off to war, and they're going to take your daughters. And at the end of the day, people are like, that's fine. Like, we'll take that. We just want someone to tell us what to do. And I think like there's this really great opportunity to say like, okay, that probably nails a lot of our experiential feeling. And then we can read the story and say like, well, let's play it out. Like, if that's what we do, if we give into that, here's how that story is probably going to unwind. So now the question is, you've seen that scenario play out. Do you want to replay that, or do you want to try to do something different? And there's this weird thing that happens like in the writings of Paul, and you really see it in the Gospel of Luke, where women have some prominence in the early church. This is always true when there's like a revolution. Women and men get like really co-leadership. But as the revolution starts to gain power, it goes right back to the institution, right? So like there's a lady in Acts who's called an apostle, and Priscilla is more important than her husband Aquila. And you know that because her name comes first. It's Priscilla and Aquila. It's not Aquila and Priscilla. And then later you get Paul saying, I don't permit women to speak in the assembly. So what happened? Social norms, like an overdoing social norms too much is just like too scary for people. And we're in the middle of that.
So how do we reconcile that?
Well,
I don't know. Yeah,
I don't know either. I will tell you this: what I've come to appreciate about the Bishop of Texas is a sort of like meaningless story in some ways. Is he's been the bishop now for like 12 years. And early on, he didn't take any kind of hard stance in favor of gay clergy or same-sex marriage. He did not. And I came into the diocese 6 years ago, and I was like, I don't even know what this guy thinks. And I think he voted against this one time, and he did. And somebody asked him that on a thing like, hey, didn't you vote against same-sex relationships? And he said, I did one time, but procedurally, not theologically. Like the way it was being done was like not the proper procedure. And so what I've come to appreciate actually about Andy is that he has a long arc. This is going to sound really nuts, right? But as I think about church and a community, I could make some really quick theological pivots and people would leave. And the people that leave are the ones that need me the most. Because when they leave, they're going to go somewhere that sounds just like them. So the more I can keep people connected, even if I think that they're wrong in their stances, the more hope we've got about having a conversation. And I sort of think that's the wilderness experience a little bit. It's really hard. If I tried to do things that are really efficient, I mean, look, going from Egypt to Israel takes 40 days, but it took them 40 years. And look, I would have made that journey in 30 days. I'm just going to be honest, because I'm just like that guy, you know. But then you miss the whole process. It's sort of like my image actually is that I grew up with a particular tree spiritually, and then I got some new ideas grafted into the tree. And then it takes a really long time for those grafts to lay down new roots into sources that I'm not used to drinking from. Like I read this book and I'm like, oh my God, like, why didn't I get this 20 years ago? And it's because it takes a long time to lay down new roots. And that doesn't mean that like, hey, well, we're just doing our best. Like, I don't mean that's okay, but I do think it's descriptive. And I do think there's a whole lot to say, like, look, it's taken me 42 years to get where I am. So how can I expect somebody else to do it in 42 seconds? I don't even think I'm ahead. Like integrating my own personhood is just like, that's, Eric Erickson says, I won't figure that out till I'm like 85. If I ever do figure it out. And if I don't, then I'm just going to have despair. And so it's like interesting to think through, like, this is the life journey. And when you think about that, not only like personally, but interpersonally as a community, I think the Bible speaks of that. And so like, I actually think there's really affirmative to hear that in scripture. There's a whole lot of moral development theory and ID development theory happening. There's times when social norms are really, really important for children because we want to form them. And they don't have the rote skills. I mean, they need an identity before they can question their identity. So some of the stuff we have to instill in them for their own safety and protection in the short term, but in the long term, we want them to be able to question the system. And I think it's that both and piece, right? Like, look, I want my daughter to be able to wear whatever she chooses to wear and to be safe and to be like body positive. But the structures of the country are not going to allow that reality. So how do I teach her to value her body and protect herself? And that's a tough question, you know, because there's plenty of men that'll say she was asking for what she got.
Judo.
Well, maybe. The hard thing though, like you just said, is judo is a martial art. And boy, I'm so sick of military metaphors because it implies like, it implies victimization and violence, you know, so I don't know the answer. But like you said, and I use military and sports metaphors all the time because our language is coded with them. But surely not everything is like a life and death struggle again. And who's your enemy anyway? Who are you fighting? Like bad people? Or are we resisting structures? And is there a way we can do that without violence embedded language? I don't know, it's really hard. I think the Bible's doing that, Tim. I mean, I think the Bible is like within the scriptures, I think that's what's happening.
It's hard to pull that out though.
Well, yeah, it is hard to pull that out. And that's why I think Andy said this really interesting thing, right? Like one of our Protestant legacies is I read the Bible by myself and I decide what it means. And that's unfortunate because we're meant to read this thing in community. And that way we can have different perspectives and conversations, and there can be some of that stickiness and grit, you know? And I think what's interesting is I don't think Dolores Williams says like, get rid of cross symbology. I just think she says like, be really careful about glorifying it.
And consider this as an alternative view.
Yeah.
And
add this to your thinking pot.
the idea of what redemptive suffering.
It's hard because there is redemptive suffering. I mean, there is, depending on how we define it, right? I mean, sharing life with other people is redemptive and it hurts. And look, when we talk about a house divided against itself, it can't stand. I mean, there's times where my body is lethargic and it's good that my brain says, get up. But if I live that way my whole life, I'm opposed to my own being, you know, like if I don't learn how to have a good conversation between my body and my brain, then like I'm always engaged in some kind of artificial conflict because my body and brain aren't separate entities. I don't even know how to do that. Like, I don't even know how to like decide when I'm hungry or not. Like it's meal time, so I'm gonna eat. That sounds really crazy. I'm sure it sounds crazy. Or like, look, if I only exercised when I felt like it, it wouldn't be much. Because very rarely am I like, oh man, you know, I'm ready for that 12-mile run. But, you know, like I'll make the mistake. I'll go out and I'm like mile 6. I'm like, you know, I probably should go home. But I'm like, yeah, but that, you know, only 3 more miles and I'll get to that cool landmark. And I'll get there and then I'm done. But I got to get home somehow. You know, like this is like weird stuff that we, you know, like I can't even resolve that for myself, let alone a bunch of other people. You know, like this is, I kind of think the Bible's drawing attention to that. Or that's one approach, Tim. Yeah, and I do. I think it's really hard. And look, I want to be really fair. I think I don't always applaud everything Jesus does. There's some stuff Jesus does where I'm like, that was a bad idea. And I think that's all right. Well, and even if it's no one else thinks it's all right, that's just what I'm going to do. So
To me, that shows the human side of Jesus, that he evolved, he changed, he learned.
I hope so, right? Because if he didn't, right, then there's not any, I mean, he didn't mean anything for me. All right, I talked a little bit too much. What else from this book? Like, are there practices or are there things that you felt, again, like pushing on you here? I do have a question from Julia that is just a question. Does anybody perceive a difference between white racial narcissism and like white privilege, white fragility? Do you think those are the same ideas, or is one like a deeper or more descriptive, or,
Say that again, white.
The phrase Dolores Williams uses, she talks about white racial narcissism. That was a new phrase for me.
Yeah.
Right. Lately, people talk about white privilege, or they talk about white fragility. And I'm just wondering if those are different phrases in your head, or one describes a different reality, or like how you put those in conversation.
For me, there is a real difference. The narcissism is much more of an aggressive kind of attitude than the white fragility or white privilege. The narcissism is more, I'm better, so I'm going to put you down, or I'm putting you down so I'll feel better about myself. The other is, it kind of creeps up on us, and we don't, the fragility and the privilege, we're not aware of it. We just kind of enjoy it. And then when we realize it, we feel bad about it, or I feel bad about it.
I feel bad.
Do you think that one is a more fitting phrase for systemic, whatever you call it, in America right now?
I think they're both at play. I couldn't choose one over the other.
The thing that was sticking for me in this book, and she talks about this in chapter 7, she talks about this experience, right, in the pioneer experience, where like nature needs to be subdued. And that includes Native Americans and Black people, and how that leads to like colorism and praising white features. And I haven't read the book, but you kind of can hear the summary of the book in the title, The Bluest Eye, by Alice Walker, right? That talks about how basically even in the Black community, some of this, and it is, I think it's white racial narcissism. I don't think it's white privilege. Like, we love white features. And so narrow noses, light colored eyes, light colored skin, and you can call it conscious or subconscious, but those tend to be the definitions of beauty in the country. And I don't think white privilege fits that. I think white racial narcissism is the better phrase for colorism and white standards of beauty than white privilege, because we're just in love with ourselves, projected or imagined.
And we're drawn to people that look like us. We have a natural inclination to be more comfortable around people who look like us.
And that's narcissism. That's the definition of it, right? We're in love with ourselves.
I don't see any connection between, I almost feel they're opposites, between narcissism and fragility. The word fragility just doesn't fit for me at all.
Well, I wonder, is it if we're drawn to ourselves and then there's something different, we just can't handle it. That's the only thing in my head, but I'm not a scholar on these terms. I had totally forgotten that phrase, white racial narcissism. And I'm still trying to figure out, like, when do I use that phrase? And when do I use white privilege? And when do I use white fragility? It seems like a really powerful phrase, white racial narcissism. And I think part of the power is it's really off-putting. Like my gut reaction is to say, boy, there's not very many narcissists out there, and I know I'm not one of those. And then to start to think like, well, what is it that you think's beautiful?
That's interesting to me from the standpoint that I'm Hispanic, which, and I'm not dark, but I'm also not, don't look blonde. I'm not blonde, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
There are Hispanics though, who are lighter skinned than I am, but speak Spanish and think of themselves as Hispanics will say, I'm of Mexican descent, I'm 10th generation or whatever. That's always been an interesting and sometimes difficult position for me, because you know, you think, where do you belong? Where is most acceptable for you? I don't know if that really makes sense, but it's sometimes a struggle.
It makes a lot of sense, and the word is passing, right? And I think it's much easier to pass when you're Latinx for white standards of beauty than it is to pass when you're Black, although there's Black people that can pass.
Right.
And what's interesting, right, is you think about, and this, my mother-in-law was a international programs director, and there was this really interesting experience where people would come from China and they'd come to American high school so they could get into American university, right? It was really a staging point. And when they came here, they weren't white, so they weren't going to fit here. And then when they went back, they didn't fit there anymore either, because they'd been around white people. So these people were exiles in their own land. And they did it so that they could enter in, so they could grab the coattails of privilege and get up to these elite institutions. But the cost was great. Because at the end of the day, then where is your home? You've become homeless coming here, looking for the land of promise, but you can never fully enter into the land of promise, right? Because you could be, I mean, you can go to all the best schools and people can say like, oh, where are you from? Indiana. No, where are you really from? That's, I mean, that's tough.
I need to distract you. Okay.
Yeah.
My dad used to say to us as Hispanics in South Texas, you will always, there were 6 of us. I was the oldest, and the rest of our brothers, my younger sister way down the road, down. Anyway, he used to say, Graciela, you will always, you knock on a door and you may or may not be accepted. You're just going to have to learn to work with that and deal with that. And you may fall down, but that's okay, because you will stand up again and you will do it again and you will knock at the next door.
Yeah.
And he was just very, well, I guess it was a persistence. And you're just going to say who you are. You speak perfect English, you speak perfect Spanish. You can go either direction, but you aren't the right color in either direction completely. I have no relative, no ancestor. I mean, I'm 10th generation South Texas, so I'm not Mexican. Didn't know anyone in Mexico.
And what's funny, right, is that, and this is really white privilege and narcissism rolled up together, is a white person can say, you don't belong here, even though you've been here longer than we have.
Yes.
And there's that, if we want to read this together, I'd be happy to, because there is a Latinx female theologian who, she writes 2 books. One is called A Mujerista Theology, and the other is a book called In la Lucha. And In la Lucha is like the same idea, I think, of the wilderness.
Yeah, it's in the struggle.
In the struggle, you got it.
Yeah.
So if we want to read that, I'd be really happy to, Ada Maria Asasi Diaz. But we'd probably read A Mujerista Theology because it's super interesting.
Okay.
How do you spell that?
I'll put it in the chat if you want.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Ada Maria Asasi Diaz is the author, and she writes 2 books. One is In La Lucha, which I don't know if I've read. And the other is A Mujerista Theology. And really, A Mujerista Theology is sort of like the idea of like, hey, there's not just one feminist movement. This is like what it means to be a Latinx feminist.
Right. Thank you. That's a perfect, the title is perfectly.
I'll tell you this thing I still remember from that book, and you hear me say it every Sunday. She says, kingdom is not appropriate. The word is kingdom. And that comes from that book.
Wow.
She talks about the kingdom of God and the kinship of God instead of the kingship of God. And that's that mujerista image. And you know what I love about it? It's so easy to say, why shouldn't we just do it?
Right. Isn't that
You don't even have to come up with a different word. You drop one letter.
Yes. Yeah. Kinship.
Folks, I have to draw our time to a close because I got swim practice. I just want to say it's meant a lot for me to read this with you. And if we want to talk about it some more, I'm always grateful to, because I think this is going to show up more and more and more. And I don't know, I get scared to talk about this too much on Sunday because you do want to hold people together and you don't want to give them more than they can handle. But having some different ways we look at these things seems really important. So I just want to thank you for reading, I think, a non-traditional Christian book that sadly ought to be together. And I want to remind you that next week we're scheduled to start reading a Native American version called The 4 Vision Quests of Jesus that I hope that you'll enjoy. And we're doing 2 chapters together, and it'll be same time, same place on Zoom. You'll find that link in your announcements if you're interested. And whether you choose to read it and discuss it or just read it, what I want to hold up about it is it really gives you a frame of Native experience and Native tension and some kind of beautiful ways to look at that experience that come out of it. I actually found a lot of beauty in here, even though there's a lot of deconstruction. So that's my hope as we do this together.
It's going to be interesting since I've read a couple of books. One of them is Comanche Empire.
Yeah.
And the other is Lakota Nation, because that gives you a different view of the Native Americans. And to put that with spirituality, I think is going to be a fascinating read.
And this is, by the way, Tim, why I like reading these books in community instead of just me reading the book itself, because you've got background knowledge I don't have. And we're all gonna read the same book, but we've got these other resources and experiences. And Darlene's done a lot of work with Native American experiences and things like child rearing. And I hope that shows up next week.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really grateful for you, and I'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.